Welcome back to the Christian Mysticism Podcast, where we explore the fascinating history of Christian mysticism from the early days of the church until today. I'm Alberto de la Cruz, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Carlos Ayer, the T. Lawson Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. Welcome back and Merry Christmas, Carlos.
Hey, Merry Christmas, Alberto. It comes faster and faster every year.
It was just the other day we were recording our Christmas episode, and that was
I know.
a year ago.
Well, it speeds up. I think at some point when I was like 10 or so, an older, wiser person said, "You think things are going faster? Wait till you get to be my age." It's true.
The older we get, the more it feels like we're careening out of control.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, today we got an episode I've been looking forward to, and before we get started, though, I want to remind our listeners, if you haven't liked our podcast or you haven't subscribed, please do. It helps us a lot. It helps bring our podcast up in the status, and more people can become aware to it. So we appreciate your support, your emails, your great questions, and we do appreciate you all. So on this episode, we're going to talk about a mystic that I see her name a lot, but really don't know much about her. Why don't you get started, Carlos?
Today we have a very interesting mystic who lived in the 20th century. And as I think I said at the end of our last podcast, we get a lot of questions about things that we haven't covered yet. And I also get a lot of questions, outside of the internet. Oh, I'm curious about Maria Faustyna Kowalska. Can you tell me more about her? And that's who we're dealing with today, a Polish nun, Faustyna Kowalska. Her birth name was Helena, or Elena Kowalska, but when she became a nun, she took on the religious name Faustina. Born in 1905 in Poland, and she died very young. She died in 1938, and she entered monastic life when she was 20. She came from a very humble family, and she didn't receive much education. And actually, she had wanted to join a convent from the time she was in her teens. But many convents would not take her because of her education not being sufficient and her family being so humble. As I think we've discussed before, until fairly recently, becoming a nun required having a dowry, more or less, as it used to be the case for women who wanted to get married. So finally, at the age of 20, she was able to join a convent. And why is she so well known? Well, it's very interesting because Pope John Paul II, who was also Polish, of course, he knew about her. And it was actually during his pontificate that she was canonized on April 30th of the year 2000, one of the very first saints of the new millennium. She was one of these visionary mystics who is best known for having visions and receiving messages from, mostly in her case, Jesus, but also some messages from the Virgin Mary. And she started keeping a diary on the advice of her confessor when she was in her 20s. And it's immense. It's about 700 pages. And in there, she details basically just about everything significant that happened to her and all of these visions and communications that she had from heaven. The title of it in English is Diary, Divine Mercy in My Soul. And it covers the years 1925 until her death, 1938, when she died of tuberculosis, which back then was a really dangerous disease to catch because there was basically no cure for tuberculosis. She died just before the Second World War broke out, and Poland was invaded from one side by the Nazis and from the other side by the Soviet Union. She prophesied that a terrible war was coming and then did not live to see it. And she is classified, as saints get classified for their feast days, as a virgin. And she is venerated as the Apostle of Divine Mercy. And that's the key word right there, mercy. And even more important, two key words, divine mercy, because that is the core of her message. She focuses intensely on these communications that she had from Jesus, especially about his divine mercy. And that's not new. It's not like no one else had emphasized this aspect of Jesus's life as well as his redemptive power. It's not new, but the emphasis that she put on it was very special because of all the very specific things that she recorded that Jesus had said to her about his mercy. And I don't know if we've talked about this before. In the Middle Ages, there were images of Christ at the Last Judgment, which showed him seated, of course, on his judge's seat or judge's throne with a lily poised right next to his left ear and a sword over to his right ear. And those two images represented the fact that he was judging all of the human race at the end of time. And as a judge, he doled out justice, and that's what the sword stood for. But he also practiced mercy. And balancing those two things, justice and mercy, has always been a feature of any theology in the Catholic Church, as well as in Protestant churches too. That justice demands sometimes that God mete out punishment, but he's supposed to be merciful. Balancing justice and mercy is difficult. It's like questions I have received over the years, very pointed questions. Could Adolf Hitler go to heaven? Or in the case of this happened at my mom's house, one of her friends asked me, could Fidel Castro go to heaven? The answer her friend gave me when I said, well, if he repents at the last minute, he could be saved, because that's what repentance is all about. And my mom's friend said, well, if that's the case, I don't want to go to heaven. But what Faustyna Kowalska did is precisely this kind of very difficult balancing act between mercy and justice.
So let's talk a little bit about her diary and the visions of mercy.
Yeah, because that's the core. For anyone who wants to find out more, there are a lot of websites on Faustina. And the diary has been translated into English and it's published, available. As I said, it's very large. But it was a diary kept over time. So therefore, there are dates connected to every bit of information in there. When she was 20, when she joined the convent in Warsaw, it was then that she began to have visions. And her confessor at the time, Michael Sopocko, is the one who advised her to keep a diary. And her most intense and perhaps best known vision happened in 1931. Jesus appeared to her in a vision. And this is her description from the diary. In the evening, when I was in my cell, I saw the Lord Jesus clothed in a white garment. One hand was raised in the gesture of a blessing. The other was touching the garment at the breast. From beneath the garment, slightly drawn aside at the breast, there were emanating two large rays, one red, the other pale. In silence, I kept my gaze fixed on the Lord. My soul was struck with awe, but also with great joy. After a while, Jesus said to me, "Paint an image according to the pattern you see, with the signature, 'Jesus, I trust in you.'" And then Jesus added, "I desire that this image be venerated, first in your chapel, and then throughout the world. I promise that the soul that will venerate this image will not perish. I also promise victory over its enemies already here on earth, especially at the hour of death. I myself will defend it as my own glory." So this image ends up being painted by an artist that her confessor knew. And the image is inseparable from Faustina, the mystic, as well as inseparable from the concept of the divine mercy. And, we'll have more time to go over what the meaning of those two rays of light are all about and why people gravitate to the veneration of this image in the Catholic world. But Jesus also said to her, and I'm quoting here from a diary, "I desire that you know more profoundly the love that burns in my heart for souls, and you will understand this when you meditate upon my passion. Call upon my mercy on behalf of sinners. I desire their salvation. When you say this prayer with a contrite heart and with faith on behalf of some sinner, I will give him the grace of conversion." This is the prayer. And the prayer relates to those two different color lights, O blood and water, which gushed forth from the heart of Jesus as a fount of mercy for us. I trust in you. Of course, the red light was the blood. The pale light was the water that flowed out of Jesus' heart when it was pierced by a Roman soldier after he had died on the cross. So, with Father Sepulchro's help, he commissioned an artist, and the image is now venerated around the world by Catholics. It's a very striking image, and I first started seeing it probably the 1980s. So we're talking about something that did not become very popular until fairly recently. Much more so, I think, than any other mystic that we have talked about, even Padre Pio, who was already well known in the first third of the 20th century.
The image looks familiar, having seen it as we prepared for the show, but I don't remember seeing this. But considering the effects that the image has, according to Jesus himself, you would think this would be a little more widely spread. It's not like the images of the Sacred Heart
Right.
and others that we have seen over over the centuries. This image it looks familiar, but then again, it may just look familiar and not actually be familiar. So that's a very interesting aspect
the
to
devotion to this devotion to the Sacred Heart took decades, if not centuries, to develop. So the fact that it's very recent, I think, is the main reason that I didn't start seeing it till the 1980s and have not seen it all that frequently in the past 2 decades either. I mean, I run into it all the time. Students and other people ask me about it, but it's not as well known as the Sacred Heart or other images that were revealed to previous mystics. What I think is amazing about it is that Faustina is someone who lived through the First World War. At that time, Poland didn't exist. When she was born, she was born in Poland, and Poland belonged to Russia, was part of the Russian Empire. So she lived through the First World War, and she was very painfully aware, as everybody else was, of all the trouble that was mounting up in Europe, and she prophesied that there would be a horrible war. But there was this emphasis on divine mercy that is so fitting or so closely related to the anxieties of that period in time. And I think as the world grew even more frightening with the threat of nuclear annihilation, then this message of divine mercy, I think, struck more people as something that was very, very necessary for this troublesome time in which we live.
In her diaries, did she share anything else about this divine mercy?
Oh, yes. There's actually a prayer known as the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. And this also comes from her diary, her description of this. According to her, the prayers that are part of this chaplet and the structure of the prayers were dictated to her directly by Jesus, who promised several benefits to anyone who would say it. It's a combination of different lines of prayer. It's about a third of the length of the rosary. And Faustina herself wrote that the purpose for these prayers is threefold: to obtain mercy, to trust in Christ's mercy, and to show mercy to others. Because this is also something that is part of that core message about divine mercy. It's not just about God being merciful to humans, but humans being merciful to each other. And that's an important component of this promise of divine mercy. It's not just saying the prayers. It's the promise that these prayers will basically transform you into a better person, into a merciful person, as well as give you the help you need to overcome not only whatever problems you're facing, but to overcome your weaknesses, especially your moral weaknesses. So once again, I mean, we've seen this before with mystics who receive visions and then tell others what their prayers can accomplish. In this case, as Faustina explained it, prayer that comes directly from Jesus.
And I know Faustina's visions are a very central part to her mysticism, but were there any other phenomena that she experienced?
Well, like many mystics, she was said to have bilocated. I mean, she herself reports that, like Padre Pio, like Sor Maria de Agreda, and other saints and mystics, she was sometimes in two places at once. And one time, as she says in her diary, Jesus told her that she would recite the Divine Mercy Chaplet by the bedside of a dying man, and that he was in despair, and that her being there and praying at his bedside would obtain mercy for him. And this is what she wrote in her diary. Suddenly, I found myself in a strange cottage where an elderly man was dying amidst great torments. And when I began to pray, his soul became calm, filled with trust, and rested in the Lord. And at the same moment, I found myself again in my own room. How this happens, I do not know. Same thing that Maria de Agreda said when she was questioned repeatedly about her bilocations. I can't tell you. I don't know how this happens. Well, all I know is that it does happen. And then another time, she said she was transported to a house in her home neighborhood, once again, to pray by someone's bedside. And yet another time, Faustina was sick, and she was too ill to leave her cell and to attend Mass. But she said that Jesus had miraculously transported her to Mass. And she wrote afterward, Jesus has a remedy for everything. Again, very similar to the things that Sor Maria de Agreda said about bilocation. Yeah, don't ask me the how, don't ask me why. All I know is it happened. And that is also true of Yvonne Aimé de Malestroit, who also emphasized mercy, another 20th century nun. And they were exact contemporaries. Yvonne Aimé was born in 1901, Faustina in 1905. Yvonne Aimé lived longer than Faustina, but Yvonne Aimé had a prayer that she advised everyone to say over and over again. Jesus, King of Love, I trust in your infinite mercy. So I find it very interesting that you have these two nuns who bilocate in the 20th century and who emphasize God's mercy, and it's more specifically Jesus' mercy, right? And Jesus' willingness to be merciful, to help people gain eternal life. And until I started to prepare for this podcast, I had never linked those two nuns together, two 20th century nuns, and the fact that it was the message of mercy that linked them, as well as the recommendation that they made for people to say a specific prayer to obtain that mercy.
Besides the vision of Jesus, from what I've seen of St. Faustina, she had a lot of other visions as well.
Oh, yes, she did. And various times, her visions involved the afterlife, and especially visions of purgatory. And she emphasized, especially in regard to purgatory, that this was the one place, the one dimension in which mercy was most needed. And she encouraged everyone, of course, to pray for those who were in purgatory. But she had very, very detailed visions of all three places in the afterlife: hell, purgatory, and heaven. As Dante, the great medieval Italian poet, did in his Divine Comedy, which is the 3 separate volumes, the Inferno, Hell, Purgatorio or Purgatory, and Paradiso or Paradise. Dante takes the reader through these different landscapes and heavenly scapes when you get to heaven. But her visions are very different from Dante, because Dante, in his poem, he puts very specific characters into each of these locations and focuses on what specific sins led to their being punished in whatever way it is that they're being punished. Her visions are not, well, let me back up. Her visions are detailed, but they're not the same as Dante's. What I'm trying to say is that, she is relying on things that she might have read about what hell, purgatory, and heaven are like, but she's not slavishly copying someone else's version. This is her revelation. For instance, concerning hell, I'm going to read from the diary, and I'm going to skip over some parts and read only ones that I think convey a sense of what her visions were like. So, she says, I saw 2 roads. One was broad, covered with sand and flowers, full of joy, music, and all sorts of pleasures. People walked along this road, dancing and enjoying themselves. And they reached the end without realizing that at the end of the road, there was a horrible precipice that is the abyss of hell. And souls fell blindly into it as they walked, so they fell. And their number was so great that it was impossible to count them. So the road to hell being broad and many people walking that road, you can get that from the gospel. There's nothing there that hasn't been previously said, especially said in the gospel itself. And then I saw another road, or rather a path, for it was narrow and strewn with thorns and rocks, and people who walked along it had tears in their eyes, and all kinds of suffering befell them. Some fell down on the rocks, but stood up immediately and went on. And at the end of the road there was a magnificent garden filled with all sorts of happiness, and all these souls entered there. The very first instant they forgot all of their sufferings. Well, this very graphic description of the 2 roads mentioned in the Gospels by Jesus himself. Now, as she moves on past this description, this is where we get the special details Faustina provides. Today I was led by an angel to the chasms of hell, she says. It's a place of great torture. How awesomely large and extensive it is. And then she details the kinds of tortures that she saw. They're not like Dante's tortures. The first torture constitutes hell, is the loss of God. The second is perpetual remorse of conscience. The third is that one's condition will never change. The fourth is the fire that will penetrate the soul without destroying it, a terrible suffering, since it is a purely spiritual fire, lit by God's anger. The fifth torture is conditional darkness and a terrible suffocating smell. Despite the darkness, the devils, the souls of the damned, see each other and all the evil, both of others and their own. The sixth torture is the constant company of Satan. The seventh is horrible despair, hatred of God, vile words, curses, and blasphemies. These are the tortures suffered by all the damned together. But that's not the end of their sufferings. There are special tortures destined for particular souls, and these torments apply to the senses. Each soul undergoes terrible and indescribable sufferings related to the manner in which it has sinned. This, too, relies on previous visions of hell, including the larger outline that she presents here of the different levels of hell, or the different tortures of hell. That kind of matches Dante's Inferno. But she emphasizes here that the first torture is the loss of God and the knowledge that this loss is eternal. I once spent a considerable amount of time reading this 17th century Jesuit writer Juan Eusebio Nierenberg. He was an Austrian who was born in the Spanish court, hence the weird combination of Spanish first names and a Germanic last name. Well, Juan Eusebio had very lengthy meditations on hell. He didn't claim that these were visions that he was having. He was constructing a sort of theological landscape of what hell is like. And then I started reading other 17th century writers describing hell. And the variety of descriptions is really immense. One of these writers, also Spanish, said that the worst torture in hell was the fact that there was no personal space. And the image that he evoked is very frightening if you think about it. He said, hell is like a giant wine press, and the souls in hell are like grapes in a wine press. That's how closely together they are to each other. And everyone is miserable together. They are all squashed together with no personal space. But Juan Eusebio Nierenberg went one further. And I thought of this immediately upon rereading this description of hell from Faustina, is that the second torture, Faustina's hell, is perpetual remorse of conscience. Nierenberg focused on that too. He said that that was the worst thing about hell, that you would, for eternity, think about the bad things you had done that had put you into this horrible place. And there's a lengthy paragraph in Nierenberg where he describes whatever sin it was that this person might have committed and is thinking about, and then would say, ahora lo pago. Now I'm paying for it. Now I'm paying for it. Forever and ever. Without a psychiatrist to help you get past it. And for another point of contrast, St. Teresa of Avila had a very different vision of hell. It wasn't a vast space for Teresa. For her, it was a personal, tiny little cramped space, basically like a cubbyhole in a filthy tunnel, filthy, smelly tunnel, into which she was forced to crawl. And there was no room to lay down, much less to stand up. You were just crammed in there like a sardine in a can. A very personal hell, as opposed to this large hell that Faustina is talking about. So I bring this up, and I'm comparing these different visions for a reason. And this is that these visions are very graphic, but at the very same time, they're highly symbolic. This is not to be taken as a description that one might say is like a photograph of a very, very specific place that only looks one way. It only has one appearance. No, these are meditations, suggestive images. And I should add that I kept running into this warning several times in my reading on Faustina, that these visions, while very graphic and also very effectively conveying a truth, don't need to be taken literally. They're pretty much like a metaphor in language or a painting that's intended to evoke certain emotions or convey certain ideas.
Well, one thing I've learned doing this podcast with you on this topic is that mere words cannot do justice to what these mystics have seen. They've all pretty much have said the same thing. They just can't describe it. So I don't find it all that odd that these statements or these visions are come along with a disclaimer that they're not to be taken literally. And at least in my view, it's really hard to understand eternal damnation or eternal joy, eternal bliss, because we really cannot understand eternity. We live in a linear space. Because as you were reading this, I'm listening to, all the different tortures and stuff, and I'm wondering, how long can someone withstand that? But it's really, time really doesn't play a role here. So how do you describe eternal remorse? How does that feel? We know what remorse feels in the temporal realm. We feel remorse, but you can't even begin to imagine how remorse would feel, an eternal remorse would feel like. So it's really hard. I can understand why you really can't take these things literally, because you can't understand how it works in that environment outside of time. And I'm afraid to say it, but it's probably a lot worse than we can imagine.
Oh, yes. Yep. And, that's true. Also, when it comes to, as you said, eternal suffering and eternal bliss are inconceivable, because what is eternity like? There's no way that we can have that experience. But what I would like to emphasize at this point, is that this vision of hell that she has, being, somewhat similar, but not exactly the same as other visions of hell that one could read in her day and time, they are there as a counterpoint to this message of the divine mercy. Her whole point, I said I was going to be skipping over some parts here and just reading those that give our listeners a glimpse of what her vision of the afterlife is. What she keeps emphasizing, and I need to stress this, is that mercy can be yours. Mercy is there to be had. All one has to do is ask for it and to practice it in this life with one's family, neighbors, and perhaps even with one's enemies. But her vision of purgatory, is again, without getting into very many details, there are similarities with things that she might have read. But what she emphasizes is that in one vision where she's taken to purgatory by her guardian angel, she asks the souls what their greatest suffering is. And she says, they answered me in one voice that their greatest torment was longing for God. But of course, as is the case in Dante's Purgatory, as well as Catherine of Genoa, whom we've spoken about before, there's an underlying joy to the suffering in purgatory, because it's not eternal, that you're being cleansed, literally. You're being made to realize how far you are from God, and that distance was caused by your behavior. But because you repented of your behavior while you were alive, you will eventually be with God. So this longing for God is fulfilled in purgatory. And she also emphasizes in her visions about purgatory how important the prayers of the living are for the dead in purgatory. And in this respect, she's being very Catholic in defending the idea that the prayers of the living actually do comfort and eventually have an effect on lessening the suffering of those in purgatory. And her vision of heaven, her visions of heaven, I should put it in plural, visions of heaven, they're very much like all other descriptions of heaven, where the main message is it's inconceivable, right? There's happiness, there's bliss. And as she says, and I'm quoting from one of her visions of heaven, this source of happiness is unchanging in its essence, but it is always new, gushing forth happiness for all creatures. God has given me to understand that there is but one thing that is of infinite value in his eyes, and that is love of God. Love, love, and once again, love. Nothing can compare with a single act of pure love of God. So it's an echo of just about everyone we've talked about before on this podcast, that this bliss that one feels, whether it's, temporary union with God or eternal, unending bliss, is all about love. And if one thinks about it in purely human terms, anyone who's been in love, or anyone who loves a child or relative or a friend, right, knows how special love can be. Well, imagine the ultimate love. That's what she's saying here. And it repeats itself in mystic after mystic after mystic, especially this bliss, this eternal joy, eternal happiness, indescribable.
We have spoken about her visions of hell, purgatory, and heaven, but she had other visions directly from Jesus and messages from him.
Oh, yes. Many of them, they echo each other. They echo the central message, such as, for instance, this one. Jesus said to her in one of these visions, I am sending you with my mercy to the people of the whole world. I do not want to punish aching mankind, but desire to heal it, pressing it to my merciful heart. Once again, I don't want to punish people. My heart overflows with great mercy for souls, says Jesus in another vision, and especially for poor sinners. It is for them that the blood and water flowed from my heart as from a font overflowing with mercy. And then I'm just going to read some more of these messages that she received from Jesus in no particular order, but I've chosen these because they emphasize the fact that this mercy can be overwhelming, but it requires searching for it and doing something for it. It's not a gift imposed on anyone. It's a gift that has to be sought, and it's a gift that requires certain behavior. So, a quote from one of these visions. Jesus speaking. Souls that make an appeal to my mercy delight me. To such souls I grant even more graces than they ask. I cannot punish even the greatest sinner if he makes an appeal to my compassion. Back to that question I got at my mom's house about Fidel Castro going to heaven. This is what she's emphasizing here. I cannot punish even the greatest sinner if he makes an appeal to my compassion. Another message. Tell my priests that hardened sinners will repent on hearing their words when they speak about my unfathomable mercy, about the compassion I have for them in my heart. To priests who proclaim and extol my mercy, I will give wondrous power. I will anoint their words and touch the hearts of those to whom they will speak. And then another vision, it gets very specific. Well, how do you seek this mercy? Daughter, when you go to confession, to this fountain of my mercy, the blood and water which came forth from my heart always flows down upon your soul and ennobles it. Every time you go to confession, immerse yourself entirely in my mercy, with great trust, so that I may pour the bounty of my grace upon your soul. When you approach the confessional, know this, that I myself am waiting there for you. I am only hidden by the priest, but I myself act in your soul. Here the misery of the soul meets the God of mercy. Tell souls that from this fount of mercy, souls draw graces solely with the vessel of trust. If their trust is great, there is no limit to my generosity. So this is just the opposite of what in our culture used to be called a fire and brimstone sermon, right? Scaring people into good behavior by emphasizing the horrors of hell. So though she has visions of hell, this is what most of the diary reads like, the passages that I've just read.
In these writings that you have shared with us, you can really see the focus is on God's mercy, on Christ's mercy. Everything else is secondary almost. It's that mercy. And of course, that mercy is the most important thing, because without God's mercy, we're lost. So it's just amazing. Of all the mystics we've talked about and we've gone over, this has really impressed me how the mercy is really such a central focus, and her visions kind of give you a perspective that is different from what we've seen, or more in depth than what we've seen before.
Yeah, as I said before, I was struck preparing for this podcast how she and Yvonne Aimee, another, almost exact contemporary, are both nuns who have, lead very devout lives and have mystical experiences, and both are emphasizing mercy in the 20th century, which, if you think in terms of the horrors of the 20th century, the vast scale at which, human beings were able to kill each other and inflict incredible suffering upon one another. Here's this message of mercy. It's never too late. Turn away. Turn away. And this can be seen in the following passage. Jesus says, "Be not afraid of your Savior, O sinful soul. I make the first move to come to you, for I know that by yourself you are unable to lift yourself to me. Child, do not run away from your Father. Be willing to talk openly with your God of mercy, who wants to speak words of pardon and lavish his graces on you. But like many other mystics who end up being linked to prophecy, there is also another 20th century dimension to Faustina, which is that all of this mercy, Jesus tells her, is being showered on the world. And, actually Jesus is making her his envoy for the whole world, not just for Poland, it's for the whole world, because the end is near. All of this mercy has an apocalyptic dimension. And here's as clear as it can be from her diary. Jesus says to her, "Speak to the world about my mercy. It is a sign for the end times. After it will come the day of justice. Souls perish in spite of my bitter passion. I am giving them the last hope of salvation, that is the feast of mercy. If they will not adore my mercy, they will perish for all eternity." Secretary of my mercy, that's what Jesus calls her many times in the diary. Secretary of my mercy. Write, tell souls about this great mercy of mine, because the awful day, the day of my justice, is near. But no date is given. As is sometimes the case, there have been so many religious figures who in the past have given very precise dates that come and go and then nothing happens. But it's the nearness of it. But if you think about it, the New Testament says the same thing. In the New Testament, those passages in which Jesus talks about the end times, he often emphasizes that it's just around the corner. And be ready, because you don't know when it's coming. So once again, this has a unique 20th century kind of twist to it, but it's also very much what you read every century about the end times.
Well, I think we've discussed this before on other episodes. Time to God is totally different than what it is to us. I think it's in the Psalms where David said, 1,000 years is one day and one day is 1,000 years to God.
Right.
I think we're going to meet God, whether it be by death or by the end of the world. So either way, it's death. We have no idea. Just like the end of the world, we have no idea when we're going to die. So
right.
It's best to be prepared.
Yes. And for all we know, outside of space-time, this other dimension, which could be parallel to space-time. So the end is always there, always near, personally as well as, historically for the whole human race. But I have one passage here that is a very nice passage with which to close, because it sums up that dimension of the central message that I spoke about before, which is that receiving mercy requires being merciful. And here's that message from the diary. This is Jesus speaking to the secretary of his mercy. Write this for the many souls who are often worried to carry out an act of mercy. Yet spiritual mercy, which requires neither permission or storehouses, is much more meritorious and is within the grasp of every soul. If a soul does not exercise mercy somehow or other, it will not obtain my mercy on the day of judgment. Oh, if only souls knew how to gather eternal treasure for themselves, they would not be judged, for they would forestall my judgment with their mercy. So there's a very practical, ethical message there for everyone. If you want mercy, dole it out yourself.
With spiritual mercy being the most important one.
Right.
Praying for others, feeling for others, loving your neighbor.
Yeah. Again, it is always the case with every mystic, every Christian mystic. The message is ancient. The message is new. It's somehow crafted. The message itself is crafted in a way that speaks to time and place, despite the fact that it's a very old message that's been heard before.
The message has been around for 2,000 years, and it just does not get old.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And it requires, again, as Faustina keeps saying, and as Jesus keeps saying to Faustina, mercy is a two-way street.
It certainly is. I was really looking forward to this episode, and I was not disappointed. What an incredible saint, what an incredible mystic, what an incredible message she had. I really enjoyed it, and I hope our listeners enjoyed this as well. And it's going to be hard for you to top it, but we have a new year starting next year, a new episode, and believe it or not, our third season. This will be our third year doing this.
Wow.
So our third year. So tell us how we're going to kick off 2025.
Well, we get comments and questions, and sometimes they're very, very helpful, extremely helpful, because these comments, questions, give us a very clear view of what it is that our listeners are hearing and still have questions about. So one recent comment had to do with the issue of suffering and pain, and it wasn't posed as a question. Why is it that all of these mystics we've been hearing about have lives that are so full of suffering and pain, and what's the role of suffering and pain on the mystical journey? So I thought maybe we should, instead of focusing on a specific mystic, focus on this dimension of the mystical path and what the role of suffering and pain is. And can it be possible to be a Christian mystic and not find some joy or some purpose in pain and suffering?
Well, we're all looking forward to that one. Once again, we want to thank our listeners for tuning in, for their constant support. We want to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas, a very Happy New Year. And until the next episode in January of 2025 in the new year, we want to thank all of you for listening to the Christian Mysticism Podcast. If you have any questions for Dr. Eyre, you'll find our email address in the show notes. Just send it over and we'll try to answer it in a future episode. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast.